Right now, somewhere close to you, someone is stopping work to eat lunch.
They will be back at a desk in 40 minutes. Nobody thinks about it. 4,500 years ago, on a limestone plateau above the Nile, 20,000 people stopped at the same moment. The hauling ropes went slack, the dust settled, and the smell of baking bread came up the hill. We know what they ate. We know it in kilograms. And what these people had for lunch turns out to be the strongest evidence we have about who they actually were. The Great Pyramid is built from roughly 2.3 million blocks of stone. Each one averages 2.5 tons. The whole thing went up in about 20 years. Run that arithmetic, and you get one block set every few minutes of daylight for 2 decades. That is the number everyone repeats. Here is the number nobody repeats: 20,000 people every day for 20 years. Somebody had to feed them, not once, not for a festival, every single day, for an entire generation. Herodotus came to Egypt 20 centuries after the pyramid was already old. He wrote that 100,000 slaves built it, driven in shifts of 3 months. For 24 centuries, that was the story everyone told. It survived because it felt right. A monument that impossible had to have been paid for in suffering, and slavery was the only currency large enough to explain it. Hollywood filmed it that way. Textbooks printed it that way. Nobody checked, because the pyramid was the evidence, and the pyramid could not be cross-examined. Then archaeologists went looking for the place those workers slept. They found it in the sand south of the Sphinx, and it was not a slave camp, it was a kitchen, an industrial one. What was inside that kitchen rewrites who built the pyramids. The archaeologist was Mark Lenner. He was not hunting for treasure. He was hunting for garbage. Treasure tells you what a king wanted you to believe. Garbage tells you what actually happened. Under the sand, he found streets laid out on a plan, which is the first thing that should have been impossible. Long galleries with sleeping platforms arranged in rows like barracks, storage rooms. Workshops for copper tools because copper chisels go blunt against limestone and somebody had to sharpen them every single day. And then ovens, not one oven. Bakeries, built at a scale that made no sense for a village. The floors were littered with heavy pottery bread molds, the kind you fill with dough and bury in hot ash. They came out by the thousand. Next to the bakeries stood vats for brewing. In ancient Egypt, bread and beer were not a meal, they were a wage. Egypt had no coins for another 2,000 years, so labor was bought with calories, and the state paid its bills in loaves and jars. This town was producing both at a volume that only makes sense if you are paying a payroll, and it was not one workforce but 2. A corps of permanent staff lived at Giza year-round, and every summer, when the Nile flooded and the fields went underwater, thousands of farmers walked in to work the season. They were not dragged. They came when there was nothing to farm, and the state fed them for it. The town that Lenner uncovered is not a camp. It has a footprint measured in hectares, with a wall around it, and the layout of a settlement that expected to exist for decades. The part excavated so far served the last of the 3 great pyramids, the one built for Menkaure, which means what we are looking at is the tail end of the operation, already running smoothly, already institutional. Whatever this was, by then it had been doing it for 2 generations. But bread and beer only tell you that people were fed. They do not tell you how well, and how well is the entire question. To answer it, you have to leave the ovens and go to the rubbish heaps, because the thing that finally settles what these people were is not the bakery, it is the bones. A zooarchaeologist named Richard Redding spent years counting them, not weighing, counting one fragment at a time. He identified 25,000 bones from sheep and goats, 8,000 from cattle, 1,000 from pigs. Then he did the arithmetic that nobody expected. Working back from the ratios and from how much meat comes off each animal, Redding calculated the daily kill. 11 cattle, 37 sheep or goats, every single day. That is more than 4,000 pounds of meat slaughtered daily to feed the men moving the stone. Stop and sit with that number. This was not gruel. These people were eating beef. And Egypt does not raise cattle at Giza. Cattle need pasture, and the pasture was in the delta, far to the north, which means someone was driving herds across Egypt on schedule for 20 years, so that the men on the ramp could have meat. That is not how you treat people you own. That is a supply chain. Somebody planned it, budgeted it, and kept it running for a generation. But the bones had one more thing to say, and it is the detail that gives the whole town away. Redding did not find the meat spread evenly. In the galleries where the ordinary crews slept, the bones were mostly sheep and goat. In the houses of the overseers, the bones were cattle. Beef was the better cut, and the better cut went up the ladder. You can read the chain of command in the garbage. There were bosses, there were ranks. There was a system that decided who ate what. Slaves do not have overseers who eat better. Slaves have guards. And this town had names. The workers organized themselves into crews, and the crews signed their work. Deep inside the pyramid, in chambers never meant for human eyes, they painted their gang names on the stone. One crew called itself the Friends of Khufu. Another called itself the Drunkards of Menkora. Read that again. The men hauling 2.5-ton blocks up a ramp in the sun named their team after drinking. That is not the vocabulary of the enslaved. That is a nickname. You only get a nickname if you belong somewhere. So if they were fed beef and they named their own crews, what happened when the work broke them? Because it did break them. The bodies are the last piece, and they were found by accident. In 1990, a tourist riding near the plateau was thrown when her horse stumbled into a hole. The hole was a tomb. Excavation began that year under Zahi Hawass, and what came out of the sand was a cemetery for the workers themselves. The skeletons carry the signature of the job. Vertebrae compressed from years under load, joints worn smooth. The arthritis of people who moved stone for a living. None of that is a surprise. This is the surprise. Many of those skeletons have broken arms and broken legs that healed, and they did not heal crooked. The breaks knitted back into good alignment, which is what happens when someone sets the bone and splints it. Somebody was treating them. 2 of them go further. 2 workers survived amputations, one of a leg, one of an arm, and the cut ends of those bones are worn smooth, polished by years of continued use. They did not die on the table, they lived for years. Someone amputated a limb, someone nursed them through the infection that should have killed them, and the community carried them for the rest of their lives. Think about what that costs. A man who cannot haul stone is on the accounting of forced labor, a man you stop feeding. Giza fed him anyway, for years. And when he finally died, they buried him with grave goods, in a tomb of his own, in the shadow of the pyramid he had helped build. That is the part that ends the argument. Not the beef, not the beer, not the crew names, the graves. A state that owns your body does not spend its most precious real estate on you. Egypt did not bury slaves next to kings. Proximity to the pharaoh in death was the most valuable thing a person could be given. These people were given it. The pyramids were not raised by 100,000 slaves under a whip. They were raised by something far stranger and far more familiar, a workforce. 20,000 people who clocked in, ate beef and bread, drank beer, joked about being drunkards, got hurt, got treated, and got buried with honors. The greatest structure of the ancient world was built by people who took a lunch break. We spent 24 centuries imagining suffering on a scale that never happened, and in doing so, we missed the thing that is actually astonishing. Herodotus gave us 100,000 slaves, because cruelty is the easiest explanation for anything enormous. The bones gave us something harder to accept. Not that Egypt could force people to build a mountain, that Egypt could organize, house, feed, and doctor a small city every day for 20 years without it falling apart. Next time you stop for lunch, remember that the Great Pyramid was built by people doing exactly that.